By May of 326 BC, the Macedonian army had spent nearly a decade dismantling every empire from Greece to Persia. Alexander the Great was undefeated, yet as his forces pushed into the Punjab region of the Indian subcontinent, they encountered a barrier that could not be solved by a simple charge. That barrier was the Jhelum River. Melting Himalayan snow and the onset of the monsoon rains had transformed the waterway into a deep, fast-flowing torrent. The currents were so aggressive that any attempt at a standard infantry crossing was likely to end in a mass drowning. On the eastern bank, King Porus of the Pauravas waited with a force of over 30,000 men. Porus was a physically imposing leader, standing 7 feet tall, and he had spent weeks entrenching his troops at the most likely landing sites to ensure the Macedonians remained pinned to the opposite shore. Porus anchored his defense with a line of armored war elephants. While the Macedonian cavalry was the core of Alexander's strike force, horses have a biological aversion to elephants. The unfamiliar scent and the sheer scale of the animals meant that Alexander's mounts would likely bolt or refuse to enter the water if they saw the beasts waiting for them. Alexander faced 2 equally dangerous options: a direct assault into the teeth of an elephant line, or waiting for the dry season while Porus continued to gather reinforcements from the surrounding kingdoms. To break the stalemate, Alexander began a campaign of nightly psychological pressure. He ordered his cavalry to ride up and down the riverbank, lighting massive fires, blowing horns, and shouting to simulate an imminent attack. This top-down view shows how Porus initially responded. For nights on end, the Indian army mirrored every march, rushing heavy infantry and elephants to match Alexander's movements. But because the Macedonians never actually entered the water, the Indian troops were subjected to a constant cycle of high-stress mobilization, followed by nothing. Eventually, Porus's forces stopped responding. They grew accustomed to the nightly disturbances and remained in their camps, leaving only light scouts to watch the river. The Indian army was conditioned to view the Macedonian maneuvers as a bluff. The success of this strategy relied on the idea that the most effective way to hide a real movement is to repeat it so often that it becomes part of the background noise. While Porus watched the main camp, Alexander prepared his strike force. He left General Craterus behind with the bulk of the army, instructing them to keep the fires burning, and even placing a body double in the royal tent to maintain the illusion that the king was still present. Under the cover of a massive thunderstorm, Alexander led 11,000 elite troops 17 miles upstream through thick jungle. The rain and wind helped mask the sound of their movement as they prepared to cross at a point where the river was divided by a heavily wooded island. The crossing nearly ended in disaster. As the first rafts hit the bank, the men realized they were stuck on an island rather than the mainland. They had to scramble through the mud to find a way across a second hidden channel of the river, while the storm began to break. The delay was costly. By the time the strike force reached the true eastern bank, the sun was rising. Porus's scouts spotted the movement and immediately rode back to warn their king that the Macedonians were finally across. Even the most detailed plans are subject to friction. Alexander's ability to land his troops and immediately form a battle line, despite the geographic error, was what allowed the strike force to maintain its footing on the eastern bank. As the two armies finally met, Alexander had to manage a specific spatial challenge. He needed his cavalry to break the Indian lines, but he had to do so while keeping his horses as far as possible from the line of elephants in the center. He began the engagement by ordering his horse archers to harass the Indian left flank. The goal was to pepper the enemy with arrows until the Indian cavalry felt forced to ride out from their main line to engage. Once the Indian cavalry was committed, the Macedonian commander Conus executed a pre-planned sweep. He led a cavalry detachment around the opposite flank and hit the Indian horsemen from the rear. This created a squeeze that shattered the Indian cavalry, forcing the survivors to flee toward the center of their own lines. The Macedonian infantry then advanced with their sarissas, pikes nearly 18 feet long. They used the length of these weapons to thrust at the elephants' eyes and at the mahouts steering the massive animals, while light infantry moved in to attack the beasts' trunks and legs with axes. The resulting pain drove the elephants into a frenzy. Blinded and without their drivers, the animals turned and stampeded backward, trampling through the dense ranks of the Indian infantry who were following behind them. By isolating the elephants and using their own mass against the enemy infantry, Alexander was able to neutralize the biological advantage Porus had counted on. Porus continued to fight from his elephant until he was nearly unconscious from blood loss. After he was captured, Alexander was so impressed by the king's refusal to surrender that he not only spared his life, but reinstated him as a ruler over his territory. Despite the victory, the psychological cost was high. The Macedonian soldiers had spent weeks in the rain, fighting an enemy that utilized weapons and animals they found terrifying, and the casualties at the Gelum were significantly higher than in their previous battles. This trauma created a permanent shift in the army's morale. Shortly after the battle, when they reached the Hydaspes River, the soldiers did something they had never done before. They refused to march any further east. Faced with reports of even larger armies and thousands more elephants waiting in the Ganges Valley, the men flatly turned back. They had reached their breaking point, and Alexander was forced to begin the long journey home. The battle at the Gelum was Alexander's final major victory. It showcased his ability to adapt his tactics to a completely foreign environment, but it also became the crucible that finally exhausted the will of history's most successful army.